So I'll jump right in. From Singapore to Calcutta to Durban in the early 20th century, rickshaw pullers were infamous for their drug use. Colonial officials, modernizing nationalists, and missionaries often noticed that their most gluttonous consumers of opium and cannabis were the broken specimens of humanity that pulled rickshaws for a living. It is, however, not at all clear that this association was merited. Indeed, many quantitative studies at the time suggested that consumption was higher amongst other social and occupational groups. And yet this assumption kind of remained. So I want to explore why drug use was yoked so firmly to the rickshaw, despite this evidence to the contrary. So we should begin with the rickshaw itself. While there is some dispute over who exactly invented the rickshaw, in any meaningful sense, it is first produced at any sort of commercial scale in Tokyo in about 1869. Now, as you will all know, there were many kinds of wheeled carts in existence long before this, but they all required either the labor of a draft animal or the labor of at least two men. So the innovation was to use new technology, specifically the ball bearing, which basically reduced the physical force necessary to propel a vehicle. It was then fundamentally a labor-saving device. These new technologies permitted a single human body to pull another human being across a city. As important is the fact that there was the commercial innovation of the rickshaw for hire, which meant that a much broader market of middle class and even working class customers now had access to affordable transportation in the city. Urban landscapes were opened up and made more easily navigable by the rickshaw and its puller. And almost immediately they proved quite profitable. So we see the rickshaw quickly adopted across Asia and eventually reaching Eastern and Southern Africa by the early 20th century. But while rickshaws rapidly crossed oceans, they rarely crossed field or forest. The rickshaw for hire was pretty much useless in rural areas. Rather, it was a phenomenon focused on colonial port cities. These expanding urban agglomerations created a demand for private transportation and for short distance commutes that a single human being could pull. Colonial cities also had paved roads, a substantial bourgeois customer base, and most importantly, cheap labor. So who pulled these new contraptions? Well, firstly, they were single men. They were single either because they were unmarried or because they had left their families back home in the rural areas which they had migrated from. And that leads us to the second point, which is that they were migrants for the most part. Some were migrants from the sort of immediate hinterlands of these cities, like the Zulu pullers of Durban in South Africa, but others were long distance migrants, like this man in the image here from the Fujian province in Southeast China, who pulled rickshaws in Singapore. While it required considerable skill to navigate a rickshaw through these congested alleyways, these men were considered unskilled labor. Moreover, while this was physically demanding labor, as you might imagine, it actually required less muscular strength and physical endurance than higher paid, but still unskilled work in, say, mines or on the docks. Pulling a rickshaw was also intermittent work, in that a puller could always take a rest after a long fare. And there was no sort of foreman breathing down their back to push them on to the next fare. So what we actually see is that the youngest and the strongest of migrant laborers start off in better paid occupations. And only as their bodies begin to break down and their endurance flags do they become rickshaw pullers. So to really figure out what this kind of labor was like and what drove these rickshaw pullers to drugs, I want to do something a little bit disturbing. So if you will forgive me, I want just for a minute to suspend our sympathy and actually dehumanize these men so that we can better understand how they were treated at this time. So the word jinrikisha, the Japanese word for rickshaw, means human-powered vehicles. And these human bodies were only valuable to the extent that they were cheaper than horses. The value to the customer largely derived from the rickshaw, from this piece of machinery, rather than the body that pulled it. A high quality rickshaw with good suspension, rubber tires, fine leather seats, and a fresh paint job attracted more clientele. And not incidentally, it was also easier to pull. So a weaker human being could pull a better rickshaw. So it was the rickshaw and not the human body which tended to determine the rates of hire. And thus it was the owners of the rickshaw and not the puller who derived most of the profits from these journeys. Pullers rarely owned their own rickshaws and more often were deeply in debt to the owners of their wheeled burden. Rickshaw owners also supplied room, board, and drugs to the rickshaw-wala. This added additional revenue streams to the owner of capital and entrapped the puller, denying them the possibility of escaping this soul-sucking occupation. So drug use may not have been universal amongst rickshaw pullers, but it was clearly widespread. And it was understood both by pullers and by owners as a vital supplement to the human lives that the rickshaw required. Smoking opium or drinking cannabis was less a leisure activity than it was a form of sustenance. More than anything else, opium and cannabis were consumed as a form of pain relief, alleviating the psychosomatic strain of this kind of labor. They allowed rickshaw pullers to ignore the signals that their bodies were sending to their minds, pleading for rest and recuperation. Human bodies could keep working even though they were being slowly debilitated by this labor. Cannabis and opium were widely used across Asia and Africa as medicines. As other people in the conference have already talked about, it was used against diarrhea, tuberculosis, arthritis, and various chronic ailments. They probably did more to ease the symptoms than cure the sort of underlying causes of disease, but they were still, in the early 20th century, amongst the most effective medical interventions available anywhere. They were also indispensable for allowing pullers to go to sleep, despite the grating physical and psychological injuries that they suffered from. Indeed, cycles of debt, pain, and loneliness generated despair. And that despair then only could be managed with more drugs, more debt, more profound isolation, and more corrosive addiction. With opiates and cannabinoids flowing through the bloodstream, broken bodies could still stand up and pull, at least for a little while longer. So this is a depressing and dehumanizing story. But it's not without its momentary pleasures. One cannot deny that opium and cannabis produced highs. They brought levity and even beauty to the minds of their consumers. They were consumed in multitudes of forms and admixtures which heightened the sensations that users wished to experience. Bhang was a cold decoction of cannabis and various spices that was eminently refreshing on a hot Calcutta summer day. Insangu was cannabis smoked through traditional horns, which remind Durban rickshaw, quote unquote, boys of the easy lifestyle of their elders in the villages of KwaZulu-Natal. Smoking imbanje or ganja also affirmed one's status as a man. Men would often gather together in small groups and share a pipe, thereby forging friendships and communities in these strange cityscapes. Hindu and Muslim ascetics from across Afro-Eurasia ate majun, smoked hashish, drank bhang to enter closer communion with the divine. These narcotics revived the body, but they also, to a certain extent, elevated the soul, even as these souls were being crushed by this kind of labor. So for so many of these peasants, these specific ways of consuming drugs sustained a connection to home, to family, to tradition that were otherwise inaccessible in the colonial city. But ultimately, this was not a form of resistance. Cannabis and opium were supplied, or at the very least condoned, by the employers of rickshaw pullers. They encouraged it as a stimulant, as an analgesic, and as an aid to labor. Unlike alcohol, these did not seem to make laborers unruly or combative. It was also cheaper than alcohol and other distractions. Like the rickshaw itself, drugs made their labor more efficient. Frequently, cannabis was smoked in the morning and at midday, quickly snatching a puff, as we can see in this image, before setting off on a ride. Opium-using pullers in Singapore tended to work night shifts, which were less desirable because of the odd hours, but also because they were less remunerative. The men who worked the morning and evening rush hours needed to be quick, strong, and alert, while the dark and dull nights were less oppressive to men whose minds could pleasantly float along on a different plane. Cannabis and opiates did not help these men to break their chains. They made those chains a little more comfortable. They allowed laborers to cope with and survive an economic system that denied their humanity. Laboring bodies were broken down by repetitive, wrenching labor, insufficient sustenance, and epidemics of congested urban environments. Narcotics allowed these human beings to eke out a little more life, and their employers to eke out a little more profit from their bodies. Yet, unlike so much industrial labor, this was not hidden away on a plantation or inside of a factory. Middle-class consumers sat on the backs of rickshaw pullers and watched them labor to produce the service that they consumed. Rickshaws had to be omnipresent in the city, so that sufficient rickshaws were available at rush hour. Their need to light up and kill time in between fares restored their bodies, but they also made those bodies and their dependence on drugs more visible to consumers, more visible to their eyes, their ears, their noses. Presumably, it was discomforting to have to watch labor exploitation and bodily deterioration happen and know that you were responsible. Decrying the drug use of rickshaw pullers provided a useful scapegoat for the sins of the colonial city and of capitalist production. When colonial officials and their nationalist opponents had to watch a bent back and plodding feet as they were comfortably ensconced in the sort of cushioned leather of the rickshaw, they were forced to confront a microcosm of the urban society that held them aloft. Rickshaw pullers seemed more addicted to narcotics, not because they actually smoked more than others, but because they smoked in front of middle-class urbanites, and because they did so while their bodies buckled under the feet of their customers. Thank you.